It's The Executive Edge with Sue Firth. The podcast that gives you an edge in life and business with practical skills that you can apply to achieve and maintain success.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of The Executive Edge, the podcast that's for skills in life and business. Now today I'm recording something myself. Those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast will know that I actually enjoy doing this from time to time. And that's because I often spot a topic that fascinates me or that I feel I know something about, but I want to explore it further. And in this case, it's the subject of success. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever stopped and had a chance to think about what you feel success is, but in my experience, it seems to mean different things to different people. And because I wasn't quite sure what people would think it was, I went on the hunt for information. Now, we've just had a couple of very interesting podcast guests, and their episodes will be downloading in the next couple of weeks for you. One of them, Sean Johnson, took a period of time out after a very intense working phase of his life. And in doing so, he got the chance to work out what he really wanted. And sharing the load with his wife so that the children saw both of them more regularly, and therefore he felt very present in their lives, he realised felt very important to him. And when he did decide to start another business, he's prioritised their needs as well, and although that must be something of a juggling act, it must also be pretty rewarding for him. Now, executives who talk to me periodically often mention that they need to make sacrifices, and that causes me to question exactly what they're having to sacrifice. This would be in order to achieve their success as they see it. So that makes me ask, can you truly have a very busy working life, have a really great relationship with your partner, look after your kids, and is the effective management of all of this the true meaning of success? Well, truthfully and candidly, it's something I didn't manage to do. And for me, my marriage began to suffer because both of us weren't able to discuss what we felt was really needed in order to keep the other happy, and we eventually divorced. Now, this is not what I want for people, and I sometimes get an opportunity to be able to express my experiences such as they were, but mostly when somebody reaches out to me for relationship support. Women who feel that their men are not present enough in their lives often feel undervalued, and it's they, rather than their partner, who will seek me out for support in that circumstance. It's long since been my belief that intelligent women need three things. They need to feel heard, they need to feel valued, and they need to feel loved. But in reality, it can actually be quite difficult to achieve this. But not necessarily because people aren't willing to try, it's just mostly because our lives get hijacked by so many things we're each trying to do. So if we don't have enough conversations or communication about what those goals are, it can actually be a sudden realization that you're growing apart, and sadly, that may end up having to be the answer rather than something that could have been avoided if you'd had enough conversations early enough. So, funnily enough, I sometimes ask myself, is success a good measure of how we have managed to reduce what we're doing and yet still keep all the most important people we love happy? But the difficulty I find is if a successful woman is truly unhappy in her relationship, then the relationship itself can start to suffer because as a person she begins to pull away and then actually starts to ultimately grow away from her partner. And this is often where, as I've just implied, it's too big a gap and there are very few options at that point. Now, this would therefore make it sound as if this episode could be as equally about relationships as it could be about success, and I promise I will record something on relationships and how to keep them positive in your lives in the future. But for now, let's get back to what we consider successes. Now, in my experience, executives have some very significant qualities. One of them is that they are often extremely driven. They are very focused individuals with an enormous amount of drive. They set goals very regularly, which often makes them stand out or quite different from other people in their business. And they can at times be very dissatisfied with the status quo in their lives, or their businesses, of course, which is hence why they drive even harder for achievement. So, is achievement success for them? Well, I'm not necessarily sure that it is, because achievement is often expected by an individual and therefore taken for granted. I'd be interested in your thoughts, by the way, but I do think productivity is certainly one of the KPIs for success. Quite often I find myself discussing other people's productivity with an executive, and therefore the executive's acceptance of the level of productivity that person is doing. What I mean is that executives can be very aware of other people's performance, but that's because they compare that person with their own high standards. Now, there's an interesting podcast guest coming who will explain more about this, and his name is Steve Smith, and he's scheduled in a couple of weeks. For many high-performing people, their own productivity therefore seems to be a given, not least because they've been that productive or driven most of their lives. But many successful people judge others by their own standards, and therefore the productivity of other people can fall short of those standards, but this might be for numerous reasons. Strictly speaking, the individual involved, who's often a senior manager or senior executive, may not value very long hours the same, or they may be juggling other things, such as young children or older parents, like Sean was. They may want a shorter day and so look as if they're doing less, but actually work from home very well and still achieve a great deal. Now, I have found since COVID that we are experiencing a certain amount of COVID drag. In other words, there are still people who enjoy this hybrid way of working, and maybe we should ask, why wouldn't they? Because they get to balance their lives more readily, and this was quite possibly a positive side effect of the impact of COVID. So I asked the question simultaneously, do our measures for success need to keep up with the times? I would certainly say so. And I have forgiven myself for having fallen into the trap of feeling success is about any number of things before now, in particular a few that have been very important to me. Now, one of the things that was very important to me for quite a long time was what most of us would recognise as wealth. In other words, about having a certain amount of money with a certain amount of ease, so that if I spent a few things or I purchased a few bits that I really needed or really liked, the issue was that I wanted to be able to do that without getting particularly uptight about the impact that would have on the piggy bank. If you get the balance right between how hard you're working and how much you make, this is obviously a lot easier. And then as your targets increase because you raise the bar on what it is that you want to be able to achieve, whether that's the targets you set for the business or for your own remuneration, your aspirations accrete with them, and therefore the quality of what you try and deliver, what you pay for in terms of what you also buy, and therefore the amount of enjoyment you get from any one purchase that you also buy with it grows with it. So it's like a positive spiral going upwards. And this in turn quite possibly reinforces the idea that money comes with success and that success is about money. Perhaps, though, another and more fundamental way of looking at success is whether an individual manages to achieve the goals and targets they set for themselves. Now, this is one of the reasons why we spend a lot of time researching what a goal really is and what a realistic target might be, as opposed to, say, the unrealistic ones you occasionally come across where you've put it out there not so much as a BHAG, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal, but perhaps amongst our teenage offspring who seem to have a somewhat more unrealistic desire to, say, become a rocket scientist, when in actual fact they don't have the skill to do so, and sadly won't have the academic ability either. But this balance between what we want and therefore what can genuinely be attained while still pushing ourselves hard for quite high level goals is probably as much about our perception of what we think we're capable of and what we think would be good for us and worth pursuing as anything. Executives and senior people often have very high expectations, therefore, both of themselves and of their business success. And by itself, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just being aware of the possibility that very high goals or very high, if you like, expectations can bring about a certain amount of stress. And being aware of that stress and that it can, trip us up or catch us out is actually quite important. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a practitioner. Stress doesn't take place if you're having a fairly typical or normal life, because normal life tends not to trigger it, as you're already driven, very capable, setting goals, and all of those things are happening almost by default. But stress is more about persistently taking on more than you can actually handle. Now, some of the simple solution for that might be nothing more than dissipating that stress fairly regularly. And this, of course, is where the historical references and recommendations have come from about the fact that if your life is making you tense, then you need to release that tension. So, of course, recommendations range from simple things like exercising regularly to listening to music, to spending time with your loved ones, or just sitting in the back garden with your dog and not doing much. Now, any of these may be enough to release that tension, and you'll know if they are, because it quite literally means you'll be able to still sleep, you will not be ratty, and when you wake up the following morning, you will feel like doing this all over again. More typically, though, I find people who push very hard in life don't always recognise how much stress they're under and therefore what it's doing to them. And thereby we develop a tolerance for that high level of push and unwittingly take on more and even more, possibly because we want to, or, which is just as important, we feel we have to. Now, that's a very quick off-piste aside. I have spotted before now that some people, when you dig underneath, aren't in this for themselves enough. They don't realise that they could or should be doing this primarily with themselves in mind, and that they are the primary person who needs to benefit. And I don't just mean one individual. I mean that when you unpack it, you discover actually that they're more driven because they're trying to gain the approval of somebody. And sadly, often this approval is a parent. And in some cases, it's even a parent who's passed away. And so it makes sense as you're listening to this that their expectations of what they want to be able to achieve and who they're doing this for is actually completely out of date. But we seem to wire this in, and I think that can at times come from a parent who's pushed us very hard, told us that's what we should do, and we have never had the opportunity to stop and work out whether it's actually what we want to do. Now, therein lies an interesting difficulty with success. Many of us have worked out the hard way that the only way to be successful is through hard work. So unless you're a lottery winner, of course, and that's probably unlikely, but that might be the only way that there's a quick path to this. Otherwise, it just takes time. And in that time, we find what we're good at, we monetize it, and we start to pursue goals to achieve steps along the way so as to capitalize on that success. What comes with the territory by default is a modicum of resilience so that we learn from mistakes or even possible failures, and the determination to get back up and try again, even to the point where, as you'll hear quite a lot of the thought gurus out there espouse, that we must be prepared to fail and fail again. Now, in order to keep going, we learn to work hard, and that's why we don't give up easily either, or sometimes know when to stop. Now, Stopping doesn't mean retiring. I'm not talking about some random place in the future. I'm talking more about being able to smell the roses as we go, and you'll hear this espoused in various different forms. For example, enjoy the journey, or just take a rest, or take the load off. And of course, all of these are moments of pause, really, no matter how long they are in the bigger scheme of things, whether they're just a couple of minutes in a day, 15 or 20 minutes to choose to meditate, or whether they are a deliberate long weekend shoehorned into a month. It means that to some degree we need to build it into our list of what you might call behaviours that make you successful. At least that's what I think. There seems to be more of a problem when people undervalue a day off or a moment to themselves or just taking a break or a change, because this often reinforces this idea that pushing yourself for prolonged periods of time without respite is a good thing to do. And actually, when you stop and examine that, I'm not certain where that ever came from, because we're not talking about a single day's work here. We're talking about consistent days' work to the point where you're doing this month after month. And that's not a good thing. It doesn't make as much sense to me, and I guess at heart it reminds me of what people might have done and the habits that they might have got into when they come into the practice because they're burnt out. When we start to examine what they're doing, there are very common traits about it, and pushing themselves too hard for too long and not value the importance or the power of stopping sometimes is definitely in there. Now, on another note, I listen to podcasts myself and I watch short videos on YouTube regularly. And one of the thought experts I'm interested in is Dr. Joe Dispenza. Now, just recently he has put up a video which is all about the power of silence, and I can really relate to that. To sit in silence might seem daunting to some, but really it's just about staying in the moment and breathing for a bit. One recommendation is just to try this for 3 to 5 minutes. Just let your mind drift, but as it does, just keep bringing it back and almost listen to what you're thinking. So rather than engaging with that thought and then going down some kind of problem-solving rabbit hole, try and sit just with yourself and with the thought for a bit and just wait. When you listen to something that's going on around you, such as birdsong if you're outside, or something really gentle like the waves if you're down by the sea, then you're capturing just a few moments of time, but without any pressure. And it's this taking the pressure off, both your thought process, your mind, and therefore how your mind is a goal-seeking process, which is a good thing. And it's the reason why I find myself asking senior people during my stress management programs to turn their phone off sometimes. Although I can already tell which one of these last two ideas, whether it's the sitting in silence or turning your phone off, that might actually be the most popular enough to work. So back to success. Being successful is often characterized by achieving the goals you set to yourself. But it's also characterised by being happy, and the latter seems just as important to me. It might also be about learning, so look for and engage with situations, people who might be speakers, books perhaps, audio books, even video, which can keep that mind stimulated by teaching you something new. And this, of course, is related also to creativity, because any one really small nugget that's in those media can trigger a whole thought process for you. I also think that there's a great deal in this concept of believing in yourself, and often I find young people are full of self-doubt. Well, what I would say if you're listening to this is I can promise you it eases as you get older. You tend to get less wrapped up in what other people think of you and more about surrounding yourself with positive people who don't have the time to worry about who you are and what you say because they like you. And because you've surrounded yourself with that positive group of people, you're also energized in their presence, which makes you feel good, and that's how you know they're the right people for you. Might it also be about feeling fit and well? I think that is definitely there. The whole idea of staying fit, getting out into fresh air, keeping yourself interested, driven, getting up early-ish, perhaps not at 5 a.m, which is after the 5 a.m. club concept, but at least getting up early enough so that you feel like you've had a bit of time to collect your thoughts and you don't go into fifth gear, as I like to call it, too early. It might also be about this concept of persistence, which is, picking yourself back up when you need to. And also, I think, which I've mentioned before, this ability for people to problem solve and make decisions well. And this is never more so when life needs you to find an answer to a situation. And of course, the more senior you get, whether we like it or not, the more people lean on us to have all of the answers. This, so that you know, is also a contributing factor to, at times, making somebody feel like they've burnt out, because it just is not possible to always have the answers. But I think it might be about choosing which options feel right for you in any given situation. And sadly, it has to be accepted that at times that will not always be the most popular in that choice. And that might mean that you are therefore not always the most popular. And I have sometimes had to live with that, even if it hasn't felt very comfortable at the time. So really what I'm saying is it's an amazing mix of things. Success may take a while for you to achieve, but there is no doubt whatsoever that everybody can be successful. And if you've put it on a pedestal and it takes ages to get it, take it back down off that pedestal. Break it down into a bite-sized chunk and work out what that first chunk looks like for you. And then my advice is take action, achieve that next step, see it rather like it's a goal, just not a very big, hairy, audacious goal, because as you break it down into manageable steps, whether as an individual, as a team, or as a business, then that in itself is a measure of success. So take care, everyone. We'll have some really great guests on the platform for you very soon indeed, and I do hope you've enjoyed today. Bye for now.